Good morning. I am on the map today in Dayton, Ohio, and I am really excited to show this piece of Wright Brothers history to you. What sits in this building behind me is the second oldest airplane in existence. It was abandoned by the Wright brothers, lost to history for 45 years, and in the last few years of Orville Wright's life, he found this airplane, he restored it, he helped design this building that it sits in, and donated it to Carillon Historical Park in Dayton, Ohio. We're going to go in and take a look at it, learn about its history, learn about where it had been and how they got it back. Absolutely amazing story. Come with me. So coming into the museum here at Carillon Park for the Wright brothers, this is a reproduction of their bicycle shop. The original bicycle shop was moved from Dayton and is now up at Greenfield Village, part of the Henry Ford. And it's funny, having been in this one so many times before I was in the one at Henry Ford, how similar they feel. So it was a pretty good reproduction. But they've been able to expand this into more exhibits. I won't focus too long on this because it is a reproduction, but this is a mock-up of what it would have looked like when the Wrights had it working on bicycles. This is one of 5 of the bicycles that the Wright brothers built that's left in the world. 2 of them are here at Carillon Park. One is in the Smithsonian Institution. One is at the Henry Ford. And one is at the base here at Wright Pat. In the back of the shop is where they worked on their airplane experiments. Up at the Henry Ford, they not only have the original building, but they have the original machinery. This was a wind tunnel that they used to experiment with. And they would take airfoil shapes, put them in the wind tunnel, and see how they performed. And they did many, many, many tests. Beyond the bicycle shop, we move through this corridor. There is a theater down here. It tells the Wright brothers' story. It also has some various artifacts.
Get at something that interested us. Had obtained the best lift and drag data in the world and discovered the most effective wing shape for their flying machine. They turned their attention to building a new glider, while their sister Catherine contemplated her brother's imminent return to Kitty. Success! 4 flights Thursday morning, all against 21-mile wind, started from level, with engine power alone, in foreign press, home Christmas.
This is the original sewing machine that the Wrights and their sister used to manufacture the fabric that covered the wings. Fabric was purchased at a local department store, Wright's. That's what they built the wings out of. This is the camera that took the famous picture of the very first flight. It's the actual camera. The camera on display at the Smithsonian is a copy. And there's a sign at the Smithsonian on the camera that mentions the original is here at Carillon Park. The young man that took this photograph, his name was John Daniels. And he was kind of part of the Coast Guard, and they had these people up and down the coast, and he was just kind of hanging out. And they said, "Hey, can you take this picture for us?" So they said, of course, if the plane leaves the ground, take the picture. He's like, okay. And so the plane lifts off, and they have their flight, first ever flight. They come back to him. They said, "Did you get the picture?" And he's like, "I don't know if I took the picture. I was so excited when you guys left the ground. I can't even remember if I took the picture." And so they were like, "Well, what do we do?" So that was the very first flight, and they knew that that was going to be a special image as long as it was there. So it was on a 5x7 glass negative. And they took that back to Dayton to their own darkroom, and they developed it. And sure enough, there was this iconic image of the plane leaving the ground. It was taken just a few seconds after it left the ground on the very, very first airplane flight ever. And this is the iconic image that we see. And in fact, this image is when they did the state quarters, this is the image that is on the back of North Carolina's quarter. And they said that this camera cost about $70 at the time, which would have been a lot of money. Just before you go in to see the airplane, there is a map here that depicts various significant places that the Wright brothers frequented to get things to build their airplane. This is an area actually where this was close to home. This is where the Wright brothers flew kites. This was the location of one of their bicycle shops. This was a hardware store where they got small tools and supplies. This is the bank where Mr. Huffman presided, and he was the one who allowed them to use his field to conduct flight experiments with the understanding that they would move his cows off of the pasture before flying, for fear that the airplane would scare the cows and they wouldn't want to produce milk. Let's see, this was a store where they purchased a tent to use at Kitty Hawk. This was Wright Dry Goods. This was where they purchased the fabric for their wings. Number 7, this was engine part manufacturing. Same thing with the Garrison Machine Works, Dayton Electrical Manufacturing, that was building electrical components for the airplane, the magneto system, I assume. Patterson Tool and Supply Company. This is where the Wrights bought their machinery to build not only bicycles, but their airplane as well. Reckworth Lumber. This is where they bought the spruce to build the structure of the aircraft. Buckeye Iron and Brass, as well as Hoban Brass Foundry, building engine components. 14, this was a carriage company, and they utilized some of their pieces to build the wings, especially the wing tips of the airplane. This was Huffman Prairie. There was a trolley line that passed Huffman Prairie. Even though it was pretty much out in a kind of a desolate area, it did happen to have a trolley line that went past it within not too far off. And they were able to ride that trolley to Huffman Prairie from home, which was back down here. And then the Wrights' first manufacturing facility in West Dayton, down here. So from the map here, we will go through this door into Wright Hall, and we will see the second oldest airplane in existence. And I'll just be quiet a moment and let you see it. In 1905, Wright Flyer III was the first flying machine that could repeatedly take off, fly under pilot control for a significant length of time, and land undamaged, making it the first truly practical airplane. The Wright brothers considered it their most important airplane as their last experimental model and the airplane on which the first production aircraft were built. This original airplane was reconstructed through the efforts of Orville Wright and Colonel Edward Deeds, founder of the Carillon Historical Park. 1905 Wright Flyer III is the first airplane to be designated as a National Historic Landmark. The brothers mastered pitch, yaw, and roll with this airplane. You see he has a lever, and the mannequin. The mannequin, by the way, is meant to represent Wilbur Wright. You see the lever there in his left hand mounted vertically. That controlled the elevator here in the front, controlling pitch. You can see there is a rod running through these two air surfaces, and those are mounted to this lever, and there are cables connected to that went to the lever that he's holding. In his right hand, you see a horizontally mounted lever that controlled the rudder and the yaw. So to control roll instead of the ailerons that we have today, and they went to ailerons pretty early on, but these very first planes, you can see around his waist there is there's an area that comes up. He was basically like in a cradle, and he could move his body left or right. There were cables, and it's difficult to see there, I guess, but there are cables connected to that. And so when he would shift his weight in that cradle, it would pull on these cables. The cables then ran up here it ran up all the way to the end. And so that would pull down on that wing, and it would twist the wings. That was the wing warping, and that was what they used instead of the ailerons. And that was how they controlled the roll of the airplane. The Wright brothers learned to fly this airplane at Huffman Prairie, which is just a few miles from here. I did a video there recently, and I can leave the link to that video in the comments. Also, if you aren't subscribed and you like these videos, I'd appreciate it if you'd consider subscribing, because it does help YouTube see interest in the channel and allows me to continue making content like this. It looks like the plane was made with a lightweight metal, like an aluminum, but that was a decoy. It was actually built of spruce, and somebody had the idea that if they painted it silver, people might think it was metal, and it would acted as a decoy to keep people from potentially stealing their ideas for an airplane. They say here at the museum, people often ask, is this the original? And it is, in fact, the original airplane that the Wright brothers built. But this airplane is the one where they really learned controlled flight. 80% original. So the story goes that they mainly flew it here in the Dayton area. Then they took it to Kitty Hawk and they tested it further down there. And then for whatever reason, they decided to leave it. They just abandoned it at Kitty Hawk in the hangar. And people would take small bits and pieces of it. And a couple of years went by, and the Orville donated it to a museum, which basically did nothing with it but store it. And so when they were building the park, Edward Deeds, who was in charge of building the park here at Carillon Park, he said to a couple of his guys, go get me that airplane. And they found it in pieces, but they brought it back to Dayton. Orville himself oversaw the reproduction, or not reproduction, but the refurbishment of the airplane. And it has been here since 1950. So 3/4 of a century, this airplane has been sitting down here in this pit. Orville helped design this building. When they were building it, or when they were designing it, I should say, he said, put it down in a pit, because if you park it on the floor and have people walk on that same level, they're going to be looking up at it, and I want them to be able to see the controls. He passed away in 1948, just before this opened to the public. But it's really something that he had a part in creating this museum. and refurbishing this aircraft for its display. The Wrights needed a very lightweight engine, and so it needed to be custom built. They went to a lot of auto manufacturers, and the auto manufacturers really weren't interested in building them an engine. They were interested in building things in quantity, so that made sense. But they didn't have an engine for the plane. And so they asked a guy that lived here locally. He was a machinist. They said, "Can you build us a motor? We need it to be lightweight." And so he built them this motor. And it is aluminum. It's a cast aluminum. And then they would paint that black, again, as kind of a decoy, so that people wouldn't necessarily understand what it was made out of. This engine produced about 20 horsepower, and that wasn't a lot. They had to use a catapult system still to get the airplane off the ground. When they improved on the horsepower of the engines, they got it up to about 35 or 40 horsepower, and that eliminated the need for the catapult system. It's a dark piece and a dark room, but you can see a little cylinder right here mounted to the upright of the aircraft. That was the fuel tank, gravity feeding gasoline through a line down into the engine. That is the original fuel tank that was on the plane 1904, 1905. I thought that was interesting. There's a lot of bicycle technology on the airplane, but the most recognizable is the chains, the use of chains, the use of bicycle chains to drive the propellers from the engine. The original plane had no wheels. It had a skid system, more like a sleigh. The Wrights hand-carved these propellers. These were original propellers that they carved. Now, I will mention here that the bracing for the tail of the aircraft that went back to the rudder, there's a brace at the bottom and one at the top. So you can imagine that if that propeller came apart, that those braces were very, very vulnerable. And that did happen in the late 1900s. They had a crash. That was the crash that hurt Orville so bad, because that propeller came apart, got those braces, and it collapsed the rudder. It's believed that there are 3 original planes that the Wright brothers built. The original is the Kitty Hawk plane. That's at the Smithsonian. It's about 30% original. That's the one that you see as the primary plane at the Smithsonian. Smithsonian also has a military flyer from about 1909. That was the first military powered airplane. So that's very significant. The only other plane that we know of that's still in existence, or at least that I know of, is this one. When this airplane was found, the cotton fabric was rotten. And so they went back to Reich's, the same department store where they bought the original fabric, and they still sold that same fabric. So they bought more of it and recovered it. One interesting thing about the airplane at the Smithsonian, the military flyer, is that it has the original muslin fabric covering the wings. These engines put out a lot of oil. They really weren't sealed up very well. You can see there's fabric all around it, so that fabric would soak with oil. And that airplane at the Smithsonian has, I think it's probably sheet metal. It's back here behind the engine on the wing, and that keeps the oil from soaking into that fabric. I'm sure that they would be fearful that that oil-soaked fabric could lead to a fire. Here on the wing of the aircraft, you notice this dark spot, and the tour guide was telling me that that's repair work that was done after an incident in the 1960s when somebody came in here and, on purpose or accidentally, whatever the case, threw a cigarette butt out, and it landed there on the wing. Keeping in mind, of course, the airplane's made of wood and fabric, so it's really lucky they didn't lose the airplane. Yeah, the guy over there is asking right now, is this the original? Is this the original? Indeed it is. So the airplane was abandoned in Kitty Hawk, and people picked it over, and the majority of it was sent to a museum. The museum never did anything with it, and by the time that the people working on Carillon Park came to looking for it, the museum had switched over to an art museum, and they really didn't want it anyway, so they weren't upset to get rid of it. It didn't take a lot of convincing. However, some of the small pieces had been taken off of the airplane in Kitty Hawk, so they advertised that if you will return any small pieces that you have, we will give you, signed by Orville Wright, certification of appreciation, as well as a small piece of wood from the original airplane and a small piece of fabric from the original airplane. Plus you got his autograph. And so people were sending in parts. They were able to collect 80% of the original. Well, actually they were able to probably collect more than that because some of it was just not salvageable. This down here shows some bits and fragments of the original airplane. And these are other parts and pieces that were just not salvageable, but they have them here in the display case showing them off. But these are pieces that they recreated for the airplane that's sitting here. But still, the airplane that's sitting there is 80% original. NCR was a major cash register company here in the Dayton area, and they had a lot of factory space. And they took one of the floors of one of the factories and they rebuilt the airplane there with Orville Wright supervising the reconstruction. So this was them working on it in the late 1940s. And here's another image of it being refurbished. This newspaper clipping from Norfolk, Virginia is showing a lady who had pieces of the airplane, and she was one of the people who returned the pieces in exchange for the recognition. There isn't great lighting in this room. It does have windows, but the windows are shaded to keep the UVs out of here. It's a little bit harder to shoot video or really even see it in great detail, even with the naked eye. But it is protecting the airplane. This area is built in 3 sections: the bicycle shop portion of it, the airplane portion of it, and then this is a museum that contains some other Wright artifacts and some stories. The Wrights were very interested in obtaining a business out of their airplane. They wanted to make money. And so they hired an experienced patent attorney, and they paid $7. Winters National Bank, that was a bank here in Dayton, to obtain a patent, which came in 1906. This is a copy of that patent. The attorney recommended that they not talk a lot about their work until they got their patent, fearful of letting too much information out about their airplane, the Wright brothers still wanted to sell the aircraft, the idea. And so they went to the Army. They thought, well, surely the Army is going to buy an airplane. And the problem was, they didn't want to really demonstrate it. They didn't want to show the Army. It was kind of a sight unseen sort of a thing. And pay us, and then we will show you what it can do. And that didn't work very well. So the Wright brothers had stopped flying, and other challengers were working at this invention also, and so they really weren't able to make a lot of progress. There were a handful of people who had seen the flights, and it was really their word that was kind of the proof that the airplane had actually ever even flown to start with. Not everybody even believed that. This is a picture of a Wright Model B flying at Huffman Prairie in 1911. You can see the hangar that they used at Huffman Prairie in the lower left of the image. This is an image taken in 1909, Orville flying in Berlin. You can see as the plane lifted off how excited the crowd was, waving their hats in the air. This is another image in Berlin. You can see the airplane right up there in the upper right of the image. Quite the crowd had come out to see. This is a French cartoon of Wilbur Wright, who would become quite the celebrity. This is depicting headlines from around the world in 1908 and 09, telling of the Wright brothers' demonstration flights. King Edward VII watched Wilbur make 2 flights in France in 1909. There are some famous images of the Wright Flyer with the Statue of Liberty in the background. That was for the Hudson Fulton celebration in the fall of 1909. While Orville was in Europe, Wilbur flew the airplane in New York. He was originally commissioned to make a 10-mile trip. However, Glenn Curtiss also had a contract to fly a 20-mile round trip from Governor's Island up the Hudson to Grant's Tomb and back, and he wasn't able to do that. So Wilbur ended up doing his own commission as well as that 20-mile round trip, combined it into a flight. And they did those flights in front of more than 1 million people. Concerned about the possibility of a water landing in the Hudson, he put a canoe under the airplane just in case. This is a brass plate that was attached to Wright B flyers coming out of the Wright Flyer Manufacturing Company. In 1909, Orville Wright was severely injured in an airplane crash that actually killed the other person on board, and it left him debilitated, and so often he used a cane. This is a pair of his shoes and some of the walking canes that he used. Thomas Suffrage died, and he was the first fatality in powered manned flight. This was Wilbur's bag. He's often seen carrying this on his trips in Europe, according to the information here. This was a 35 horsepower engine that was used for testing purposes. I don't think that this engine actually ever flew in an airplane, but it gives you a good idea of what the airplane engines at the time looked like. This is an original steering wheel from a 1914 Model B Wright Flyer. None of the airplanes from that era are still around. There aren't any examples in existence. They were made out of wood, so easily rotted, and they crashed a lot. This was Orville Wright's toolbox. They say he was a tinkerer even in his older age. O.W. Orville Wright. This is an image of Orville Wright with Amelia Earhart in 1929. And the tuxedo that he's wearing there, or the suit, is here on display. When Carillon Park was being designed, Orville and Colonel Deeds surveyed the area, came over here on foot, and looked around and decided on this spot to build the Wright Hall, which is the building that even today houses the Wright III Flyer. So now there are buildings attached to the left and the right that have extended the museum, but that's still the building where the airplane is. Orville had a heart attack while working in his laboratory. He was taken to Miami Valley Hospital here in Dayton, and he died 3 days later. He was 76 years old. This picture is of his family on the day of his funeral, gathered at his home at Hawthorne Hill. This is the Wright home at Hawthorne Hill, just down the street from this museum. And it's still there, and it is owned by the park and open to tours. So thank you for joining me here in Dayton, Ohio at Carillon Park to take a look at this amazing artifact. When you walk in and see this thing sitting there, it's surreal to think through the significance that that thing had on history. It's there, but it almost doesn't seem real. It's really, really cool. And it's in such an intimate environment. You know, if you go into the Smithsonian or something and you're looking at the original Flyer, it's almost like you're getting herded through there like cattle, timed entry into the museum and everything. You go in here and it's so intimate, and there's a couple of tour guides in there willing to tell you everything under the sun about that airplane and what was going on during the Wright Brothers' time. It's really a neat experience. If you ever go through Dayton, Ohio, and you're interested in stopping and seeing something related to the history of flight, this is the place to go. If you just got a couple hours, this is the place to go. Number one on the list. If you enjoy these videos from me, please subscribe. It helps me out a lot, and I will see you down the road.